7 o'clock in the evening, and London's rush hour throttles the roads and crams the trains. As 11 million people settle down after a day's work, gas from the North Sea and Algeria cooks evening meals freighted in from the other side of the planet. Power stations from the north of Scotland to the south of France brace themselves to take the strain. Sewers fill and pour towards the North Sea. This metropolis, ringed by the M25, one of the Earth's 20 megacities, has become a danger, but not just to itself. The world is now threatened by the state of London. At Piccadilly Station, 15,000 commuters head home on the world's oldest underground railway.
About 2.5 million passenger journeys are made each day on the Underground. It's 274 stations and 254 miles of track. We employ 16,000 members of staff, and we cover an area which I believe is the size of Luxembourg.
Millions have been spent on making this ancient railway look modern, but behind the shine, the guts are rotting.
We are suffering really from an ageing infrastructure. 80% of the network was completed before the Second World War, and that means that our pumps and our drains and our track, the unglamorous side of the business, are in fact rotting away. What we need now, we believe, is sustained levels of investment from government over the next 10 years, that we can actually bring up the system, not to a gold-plated level, but certainly a bright, modern underground system.
Bright young things who throng Soho every night curse the transport, but are less keen to foot the bill for better. Rave thumps on, and fresh, raw energy for tomorrow starts to make its way into the metropolis. Because the million passengers each day underground are matched by another 150,000 who spew in and out by car. $3.5 million gallons of motor fuel slosh into the city every day by tanker from the Thames estuary. It's 2 a.m.
Our main task is to provide transportation fuels to London and the South East. Behind me on my left, you see the crude distiller. That processes some 4.5 million tons per annum of crude oil. That's 11,000 litres every minute. Probably 60% of our crude comes from the North Sea, and the remaining 40% comes from the Middle East. Every day, 50 vehicles make deliveries to our service stations and commercial customers in London and the South East. Every year, 1 million tons of jet fuel is transported by pipeline to London's major airports, Gatwick, Heathrow and Stansted.
While traffic flows die down in the small hours, Heathrow wakes from a brief nap. The world's biggest airport has an appetite for energy that matches a city like Milan. The jets alone swallow over 3 million tons of kerosene a year. Jumbos arrive carrying much more delicate fare than passengers. Heathrow drags in perishable cash crops from across the world. to fill London's gourmet stomach. Western International Fruit and Vegetable Market near Heathrow. A modern Covent Garden on the junction of two of London's main arteries, the M4 and the M25.
Increasingly, we are relying on the majority of the fruit and vegetables to come from abroad. This is purely because of our climatic conditions here. We are a country that has seasons. We're not in a situation where we as a country can grow produce all the year round. But to give the customer the variety that they need, then of course we do need to be in the world market, because the customer does want to be able to pick from all over the world.
The constant supply of the familiar and the exotic to London is a burden the earth is finding hard to sustain.
London, like most major cities, is a parasite. It's evolved over a very long period of time. It started off being parasitic on essentially a local and regional host. It is now a parasite on a much larger, indeed a global host.
Traditional street markets like Portobello are under threat from the big supermarkets. But even here, the produce sits on a vast pyramid of energy, already spent somewhere else, in seed, artificial fertilizer, farm machinery, cheap labor, long-distance transport, and cardboard packaging. The result is that the actual energy it takes to get a mango from Africa to a home in London is 600 times the calorific value of the fruit itself. And London consumes 1.6 million tons of mostly foreign fruit and vegetables a year. London's docks died 30 years ago, but bulk goods still come by sea. 20 miles downriver, stevedores at the port of Tilbury unload tomorrow's cereal, meat, oil, and potatoes.
We are undoubtedly London's port. We handle between 6 and 7 million tonnes of cargo per annum. Fruit and vegetables from the Mediterranean, dairy produce from New Zealand, which includes butter, cheese, lamb, beef from South Africa. And that probably totals somewhere in the region of 300,000 tonnes per annum.
Upriver, it's breakfast. Danish bacon, Moroccan tomatoes, and French mushrooms sizzle next to English eggs in hundreds of London's cafes. The city is a junkie, a fossil fuel addict. $11 million hungry, waking bodies open their fridges to reveal a global harvest of non-renewable energy. The energy costs locked into this intensively farmed beef are 35 times the calorific value of the beef itself. Free-range meat costs less in energy terms.
We'll kill 'em mile away. Good, isn't he? Like it?
If it's fish, it takes 100 calories to catch 1 calorie in the North Sea.
Thank you, 230.
And as the day's consumption starts in earnest, the energy draw leaps again.
On a good day in the winter, London consumes in total 2,000 million cubic feet of gas a day, which is the equivalent of 400 gas holders full, the size of the gas holder in the background there. We have various backup systems that supplement peak load. We can use liquefied natural gas, which we bring from Algeria. We also have a depleted gas field in the North Sea, which we actually fill during the summer and use during peak load in the winter.
Natural gas is the new clean fuel for power stations. It now accounts for 40% of the capital's energy consumption, though it will run out long before coal does. Derelict Battersea Power Station ran on dirty old coal, but it pioneered a form of energy conservation now popular in Europe, supplying its waste heat to local buildings. Now, deep in the city, is London's first gas-driven combined heat and power station, CityGen.
This is one of the oldest parts of London, Smithfield. We have been refurbishing the facade as it was years ago.
Behind the old facade is state-of-the-art Japanese and Swedish technology.
The heat which is recovered from the engine is transferred to hot water via a heat exchanger, then pumped through these pumps, and is transferred further to these pipes. And then here you see the distribution pipes. The system can heat more than 100 office buildings of, say, 60 to 100,000 square feet each, if not more. Normal power stations are in the range of 30%. The present new combined cycle stations have an efficiency of 42 to 45%. And with the combination with the heating, we reach 89, 90%.
90% efficiency, but only 1% of the capital's total electricity demand. Just enough to pump London's water supply. By 8 a.m., the whole city is washing, drinking, or flushing. Each Londoner uses 150 tons of water a year. Unknown to most, 40 meters below them is the new 50-mile-long water ring main, an attempt to reduce pumping costs.
We supply our 5 million customers in the London area with around about 500 million gallons of water a day. We are a massive electricity customer. Our total electricity bill is about £45 million per year, and that's split between capturing, storing and treating water and pumping and treating effluent. That's our sewage treatment works. Water is collected from the River Thames, is stored in the storage reservoirs, then comes into the major water treatment works to the west of London. The water flows down into the ring main, along the ring main by gravity, and into central London, where it's pumped out to our customers. Here we have a shaft at Merton, where at the moment, as you can see, real time, we're supplying currently 48.4 million litres of water per day. That information is coming back down a fibre optic cable in the water, through the ring main, to the London Water Control Centre, where we can schedule the water demand for the capital for the day to make sure we get the right water in the right place.
Despite the high technology and off-peak pumping schedules, 20% of London's water supply leaks away through its maze of local pipes and drains. Not so much a waste of water as a waste of the electricity used to pump it. London consumes more electricity than some European countries. One idea is to generate some of this inside London with solar energy using photovoltaic cells.
It is a popular misconception that photovoltaics can only work under very intense light conditions. In London, it would work just as effectively as in most parts of the UK. The sorts of applications will be integration into rooftops for domestic purposes, or into the cladding of buildings. In 5 to 10 years' time, it will be cost competitive as the costs continue to come down against other forms of high-quality cladding, such as curtain walling. And in a decade thereafter, it will be cost competitive against conventional cladding too.
Most of the surface area of the city's buildings would have to be clad in solar panels to generate the full summer demand. But in winter, when energy demand is much higher and the sun low, solar panels would produce far less. Solar energy might work for London, but only as part of an overall plan. London doesn't have one, but it's using more energy every year.
What we most significantly found was that the use of energy was up by 20% over those past 10 years. In other words, Londoners like energy, and they use it a lot. London's use of energy overall, not just individual use, but including industry and transport and so on, equates to the whole of the national consumption of more than the national consumption of Denmark or Portugal, about 1.7% of the entire EC energy consumption, European community-wide.
Not only is this Victorian city using too much energy, it's also wasting most of what it consumes. A recent thermal imagery study by the London Borough of Ealing revealed the heat loss from London's aging housing and factories to be around 60%. The light areas on the image show the highest heat loss. Londoners are paying to heat up the sky and the Thames.
This is the inlet from Chelsea Creek, which receives a discharge from Lotts Road Power Station, which is the generating station for the underground, provides electricity for the underground. It's interesting that the discharge from the power station is heated, which heats up the creek, and it proves to be very attractive to some freshwater fish, particularly carp, occur there in quite large numbers.
London, in 1 year, burns the equivalent of 6 billion gallons of crude oil, more than the fires which raged after the Gulf War. And yet the world's governments, including Britain, signed a pledge at the Earth Summit in Rio to make a more responsible and efficient use of the world's resources. They called it sustainability. That will be impossible without making cities like London more energy efficient. The daily gravitation towards the city centre starts. London's car drivers join the commuter army.
You're looking at probably 2-3 hour periods in the morning and in the afternoon for traffic flows, which can reach a peak of 183,000 vehicles in the very central area of London. Throughout the day, in the central area of London, you can expect over 1.5 million vehicles passing through.
There are currently in London about 2.5 million cars, and if you add in all the extra vehicles, vans, buses, coaches, taxis, lorries, it comes to about 3 million motor vehicles. Now, if you take the distance apart of parking meters, 20 feet, 3 million motor vehicles amounts to about 11,000 miles of car parked nose to tail. Now, in London, there are only about 8,000 miles of road. And furthermore, we're only still in London about halfway to what the government calls the saturation level of car ownership.
"715, that's all received. The units on scene at the A1 Boreham Wood. Can you confirm, is this a horse box involved, Oscar?
Well, it's the environmental damage which affects quite a lot. You've got vehicles pumping out various gases, going through residential areas, queuing through residential areas. You've got people wasting their time sitting in vehicles. You've got goods that can't get from A to B with a corresponding price rise. It's really a quality of life that's suffering as a result of it.
OK, then.
We're actually looking at an average speed of vehicles moving in London at no greater than 10 miles an hour. So, as we said, we are teetering on the brink, really.
Over 2/3 of all journeys in London are made by car. London cars burn 10% of their fuel while sitting stationary. And the annual output from their exhaust pipes is over 500,000 tons of carbon monoxide.
When we looked at policemen on motorbike duty, we found that they had surprisingly high levels of carbon monoxide in their breath at the end of an 8-hour tour of duty, the sort of levels of carbon monoxide that they would have had if they'd been smoking 10 to 15 cigarettes daily.
Childhood asthmas are on the increase. London streets are a hostile environment.
In 1971, 80% of 7- and 8-year-old children got to school on their own, unaccompanied by an adult. By 1990, that number had dropped to 9%. And the accompanying parental questionnaire made it very clear that the main reason that parents were denying their children the freedom that they had as children was their fear of traffic.
I'm not a city planner, but I see no evidence of a rational transport policy for London which takes into account the environmental and particularly the health effects of the internal combustion engine. Pollution, of course, is an important health effect of the internal combustion engine, but there are many others in our cities, such as stress, noise, the size of our roads.
Pollution is just one result of the city trying to satisfy conflicting needs. In the absence of an overall energy and waste strategy for London, individual systems are left to compete with each other. Abbey Mills pumping station near West Ham is a key stage in the city's Victorian sewage system, a network of old brick tunnels designed to get rid of the stuff as quickly and as simply as possible.
The sewerage system was put in to divert the old rivers of London, which were heavily polluted, and take them away well downstream of the capital. This is Abbey Mills pumping station, where the sewage from all over North London is lifted 65 feet by pumping station into the northern outfall sewers, from where it carries on by gravity to Beckton. This is low-level number 1 and number 2 sewers coming from the West End and Chelsea and Kensington into the system. We deal with something in the order of 1,000 million gallons a day of sewage coming into the works. We treat it, and that produces about 10,000 wet tons a day of sludge.
One Londoner generates over a ton of sewage sludge every year. The methane given off is captured and burned in electricity generators which power the sewage works. The remaining sludge is dumped by ship in the North Sea. But the EC has banned this from 1997. Sludge ought to go back to the land. But Thames Water claim they have trouble giving the stuff away to British farmers. In future, Beckton sludge will be incinerated to produce more electricity. The treated water flows into a now revived River Thames. It wasn't always like this.
Well, we're just coming up to Beckton Outfall, which is the outfall to the largest sewage works in the United Kingdom. And in fact, in the summer, this is probably the largest tributary of the River Thames. Well, in 1878, the Princess Alice, which was a pleasure cruiser, hit a collier that was on the way downriver. Now, the people fell into the river, and there were 640 people killed. Now, a lot of those people were very good swimmers, and it was suggested at the time the reason they died was because they were poisoned by the stage of the river. But one of the reasons the river was so bad was this gasworks. I mean, coal gas, which was produced here, the byproducts of that are extremely toxic. You get things like cyanide, phenols, ammonia, and these would be poured into the river. And at the same time, we were getting all of London's waste being discharged into this part of the river, and it was totally untreated in those days. So the river here was totally dead. And in fact, the river in this part of the Thames has been very poor right up until the 1950s, and there were no fish. In fact, the river was probably totally dead for about 20 miles here.
The only solid waste which floats in the Thames these days is sealed in containers. Much of Greater London's 2.5 million tons of household rubbish is taken 30 miles east to be dumped in someone else's backyard. The suitably named Mucking in Essex is one of London's landfill sites.
Somewhere in the region of about 500,000 tonnes per year, usually about 2,000 plus tonnes per day, coming in through the jetty operation. This is the domestic waste that's come down from West London, namely Western Riverside, Battersea and East London. It comes down in containers down the River Thames and comes onto the landfill site and is unloaded by the container cranes and eventually ends up here where we're putting a massive pipes in underneath to draw off the methane gas and eventually generate electricity for domestic use, and at the end of the day we will end up, as you can see in the distance, with green fields back to agricultural use.
Today's rubbish will soon start to rot and give off methane for many more years. To get rid of the gas, it's sucked off by pipe and burned in turbine engines, which produce around 4 megawatts of electricity for the national grid. Just enough for 4,000 Londoners. But the quickest way to get energy out of London's rubbish would be to burn the lot. Edmonton Incinerator in North London. 6 plants such as this were planned for London in the early 70s. Ringing the city. They were to burn rubbish and generate most of the capital's electricity needs. Fears about toxic fumes meant only Edmonton was built.
This is the largest waste-to-energy power station in the United Kingdom. And basically we take in domestic refuse and commercial garbage from shops and offices and simply convert it into energy. And this year we'll export something like 230 million kilowatts of electricity from 500,000 tonnes of garbage.
The toxic gas problem has virtually been solved. Today's problem is how to recycle materials which are cheaper to dump or burn.
Historically, the problem in the United Kingdom is that we have all got rid of our garbage for very, very low sums of money. For instance, I can landfill garbage today, including haulage and the landfill cost from this site, for under £10 a tonne. That clearly is Mickey Mouse money. In Germany, they're used to paying £200 a tonne for waste disposal. Hence all the activity you see in recycling on the continent.
The North London Waste Authority, which runs the station, is trying to coordinate recycling facilities for the 7 London boroughs which it serves. It has pioneered a scheme for turning North London's green waste into garden compost.
We've got many sources of compost. Obviously, our local authorities, through their Parks and Gardens department, have a lot of green waste. They have tree prunings, grass cuttings. We have sources from the public through civic amenity sites, where the public take garden waste. Once again, hedge clippings, old plants, things like that. They deposit them there. That's brought here. And as with this material, that will go through the shredder into the composting process.
As green waste decomposes, bacteria give off heat. Temperatures reach 60 to 70 degrees centigrade inside the heat, killing any disease organisms. London's green rubbish ends up as a totally organic product. Citywide composting would reduce waste output by at least 300,000 tons. Recycling is essential for a sustainable future, but despite many new civic amenity sites, Londoners are slow off the mark.
Recycling is developing, but at the present time only around 3% of household waste is being recycled, and that contrasts to about 30% of industrial and commercial waste. The intention of government is that by the year 2000, 25% of household waste will be recycled, but our work has shown that around 2005, the maximum that we can hope for is around 15 to 18%, and that's still quite a long way short of that target. The situation is that even if we were to recycle all we could, if we composted all that we could, if we incinerated all that we could, there would still be a very substantial residue, much more than could be accommodated by the available landfill facilities within London. We will always be dependent upon material flowing out from London to surrounding counties.
The government are trying their level best, but the problem for us is they've interfered in the supply chain. They're giving all sorts of incentives, known as recycling credits, to generate quantities of paper, glass, what have you. The problem is the end markets aren't there. For everything else, the market rules, but in recycling, they've interfered with the laws of supply and demand. They're generating the supply without the demand, and the inevitable happens, the price crashes. We've recently had massive reductions in the price we get for our glass, and you can almost have to pay to get rid of waste paper today rather than be paid for it. It's financial suicide.
London's scrap metal is a symbol of the problems faced by the city in its attempts to recycle more and waste less. Waste steel has little value here, so it's sold to the Far East. Yet Britain imports the raw materials to make new steel from as far away as Brazil. The market defines the supply, but sustainability asks us to take another view of the market, a market that preserves the environment for future generations, a market, for example, that pays to keep and reuse its wastes, again and again.
North Dulwich, South Hall, Preston, Tooting, Hayden Road, Wimbledon, Wimbledon Church, South Merton, Morden South, St Helier, Sutton Common, West Sutton.
London might be one of the least energy-efficient capitals in Europe. Its waste might be polluting its surroundings. But there is one thing that London is extremely good at: making money. The square mile of the City of London does very well for itself. The legions of office workers who arrive at London Bridge Station each day are the biggest contributors to London's massive economy, at £84 billion, bigger than that of Saudi Arabia.
The city ranks with Tokyo and New York as the three legs of the tripod on which the world financial system stands.
London's special skill has always been making money on the other side of the planet.
It is, on almost any yardstick, the primary international financial center of the world. Almost half the activity that goes on here is international.
A lot of money at the moment is going through to the developing world. We've invested something like £107 billion over the last few years into emerging markets. And that money is going to fund a lot of different enterprises, but it's funding, for example, the cutting down of forests, the mining of huge tracts of land. We're benefiting from those resources in this world, in the developed world. Clearly, emerging markets are benefiting as well, but it's not in a way that's sustainable.
London itself imports over 200,000 tons of hardwood per year, taken from virgin rainforests for window frames, front doors and plywood. However, London's newspapers make efficient use of softwood pulps and recycled paper. Such isolated examples of sustainability in the City of London are few and far between. The financial capital needs to take a longer term and more local view of the future.
They were creating finance for the new frontiers, the railways in America, the plantations in the south, and that it was all about creating wealth for the folks back home. London is still consuming and relying on resources from elsewhere, and we can no longer afford to keep doing that. The world is one place and there aren't any more frontiers. So the great challenge for the financial community is to come to terms with that and become a positive force for creating wealth in our own backyards.
The problem for the city is that international wealth creation and a more self-supporting local economy seem to be incompatible.
The key to sustainable development is being able to take a really long-term view, to be able to allow companies and indeed the government to have the financial support when they want to think 30, 40, 50 years ahead. Now, the point about the City of London is it's a series of interrelated financial markets. And with a market, you can disengage from a relationship in a second, just by selling. And that is what actually imposes these very high rates of return upon British industry, which then become kind of a benchmark, not only for industry, but for government. Now, you can't construct a sustainable city within a sustainable economy if the investments that you require to make in that are long-term, and the entire financial system is saying, you can't do it, you've got to think 5 years maximum.
The city does invest in the capital, in arts, theatre and architecture, the things it likes. But in business dealings, it tries to exist on a plane above the physical city and its needs.
The City of London has always had a disengaged relationship with its own backyard, British industry, and in particular the City of London itself. I think if anything, over the last 45 to 50 years, that's got worse.
In addition, natural and industrial disasters in faraway places are buffeting the once solid city. It now looks less sure of itself.
If you look at the plight of the Lloyd's insurance market in recent years, 20% of the losses that so rocked that market were caused by American problems, particularly in the area of toxic waste, asbestos and nuclear waste disposal. The financial market did not properly understand the risks that it was beginning to underwrite in those areas. Today, it is underwriting risks that will actually only become clear to us in 10 to 15 years. That's why sustainable development is directly relevant to the financial community.
The city itself has begun to get worried about the way it sets financial terms for business, and that's rebounding on itself. The city's own companies are losing market share because they themselves are so short-term. British banks are losing market share, losing business, retreating because of their own short-termism. So I do begin to see the seeds of change, and above all, of course, they see that short-term approaches by government leads to disastrous impact on the infrastructure.
Paradoxically, the impact of the vast wealth gained by London from financial services has been a decimation of its own manufacturing base. Manufacturing now accounts for less than 13% of the capital's income. While the city crumbles, its population spends its earnings on products made outside the capital. London is a shop, an obsessive importer of energy and goods, and a massive exporter of hard cash.
We do not have a balanced economy in London. We're over-dependent on services. In the past, that held us up during times of recession because recessions were all about manufacturing problems. But in this recession, we've learned that we too have to have a three-legged stool, and two legs isn't enough.
While the two legs, services and finance, dominate, manufacturing, the third leg, hasn't quite disappeared. Ultra Electronics has been making electrical equipment in London for the last 60 years.
Manufacturing tends to be rooted to a place, and the people who run it and the people who work in it tend to have loyalties to that place, which you don't find in certain parts of the international service sector. I also think that manufacturing, modern manufacturing, is actually extraordinarily healthy and environmentally kind branch of economic activity these days. If you go into a modern manufacturing site, it's actually clean and highly productive. It also produces continuity of employment, which I think enables you to have security. The service sector tends to offer highly flexible wages, employment that tends to be casualized, and which makes bringing up families, paying mortgages, constructing communities much harder.
Feeding the 11 million people in that community takes 11,000 square miles of land, 12 times greater than the land inside the M25. Today, there is just 90 square miles of arable land left in London. Heathrow, the great importer of food, stands on once prime farmland.
Some 60 years ago, that would be 3/4 of Heathrow Airport was all market gardens. And we've got to the stage in the 90s where you can count on 2 hands who's left in the industry. I've been in it 40 years myself, and I've had some good times in the 60s and 70s. Decline started in the 80s, and the 90s, as far as I'm concerned, trying to survive in the market garden industry is a disaster.
Green critics of urban systems like London would very much like to see us go back to localized food production on allotments and so on. And clearly that is something to aim for, but I think that in today's world, what we really want to see is some of the big food retailers, the supermarkets and so on, taking environment very much more seriously than they currently do, and building in new types of specification to the growers who actually supply this city to make sure that our food is grown in a sustainable fashion.
But Londoners go on eating, dumping, driving, shopping, wasting, and moaning about their city. Some of the richest people in the world live in this city. They stay here because it's exciting, and like all cities, filled with opportunity.
I mean, everybody could claim that they needed support in order to export. But there's no doubt that the Italians and the French do aid their fashion industries in various ways, which gives them a very firm foundation, which they then grow upon.
Okay, at the moment, the Department of Trade and Industry spends about £30,000 per season promoting London Fashion Week. The net result of this promotion is about £15.5 billion in exports and money coming into the clothing industry. The argument is, if you spend more, you're not asking for vast amounts, you can double and triple this. The more you push British abroad, the more people will want to come to Britain, the more they will want to come to London. On 30,000, we get that amount. What can we get on 100,000, 200,000, or even a million?
The talent is here, the eccentricity is here. The whole essence of what fashion is about very often comes from this city. You'd be amazed how many top designers from around the world just come here to steal ideas. They take them from the streets. And it seems to me ridiculous the government doesn't get behind what could be one of our strongest, and not just the strength of fashion, but the essence of what this city is all about.
What this city is all about is play now, pay later.
Both nationally and internationally, those who see their responsibility as one of ensuring a move towards sustainable development are beginning to recognize that lifestyles, the way in which we want to live our lives, absolutely critical core part of this whole discussion. Now, where are lifestyles created? London is a major exporter of lifestyles. One of the things I'd like to see the city addressing in the future is what will a sustainable lifestyle of the future look like? Not just one of them, a huge diversity of different lifestyles. I think there is a considerable role for the capital in that area as well.
As the unseen legions of night cleaners polish London's citadels of free enterprise, another day ends, with Londoners not only largely unwilling to take responsibility for their city's functions, but also unable to, because London is the only capital in the West without an elected voice of its own.
We have a problem in London, that there is a yawning gap between the Town Hall and Whitehall. There are some big issues which the borough councils are not capable of dealing with, because in the end of the day they are statutorily responsible for a very small parish. I suppose an incinerator would be another example of a difficult decision. No borough council is going to vote to have the incinerator in its area, and yet we may well be agreed that London as a whole needs that sort of facility.
The difficult decisions that London has to make will affect the world and the environment for future generations. Avoiding those decisions may have severe long-term consequences for the city itself.
If you put a wall around the city today, within a week or two, the organism will be more or less dead. Most people, when they think about sustainable development, think about sustainable forestry or sustainable agriculture or perhaps even sustainable tourism. But actually sustainable cities and sustainable urban lifestyles are where the real challenge for the future live. Over the next 10 to 15 years, we'll be in a position where over 60% of the world human population lives in urban settlements of one sort or another. That's where we've got to make the really fundamental changes that will determine whether or not our world is sustainable.